Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frank Janussi. I'm president of the Mansfield Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to one of a continuing series of Capitol Hill policy dialogues hosted by the Mansfield Foundation with the generous support of the Corporate Friends of Mansfield. The Mansfield Foundation was supported originally by an act of the US Congress, but we are a private foundation, and our mission is to promote cooperation and understanding between the United States and our partners and allies in East Asia. And we do this through a variety of mechanisms. We sponsor the Mansfield Fellowship Program, which sends US federal employees to Japan for a year of work inside the Japanese government. We sponsor networking events, which are designed to connect expert level officials and scholars in the United States and Asia to essentially weave them together as a community of problem solvers. We also have a series of policy workshops that are looking at specific issues of concern in the region, whether that's energy security, territorial security, maritime issues, space, nuclear spent fuel management, many different topics. And then we have our public outreach and information efforts. And this seminar series sponsored by our corporate friends primarily for the benefit of Capitol Hill staff and members, but also for the business community that cares about the US-Asia relationship is an example of that third basket of activity. Joining us this afternoon on the corporate sponsorship members of the Corporate Friends of Mansfield, we have Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Sumitomo, Toyota, Hitachi, Marubeni, Mitsubishi Corporation, Chevron, Mizuho Bank. I want to thank all of our corporate sponsors. And forgive me if I've left some out who may be attending this afternoon's event for their support for this outreach effort. The goal is to bring expertise on a bipartisan or nonpartisan basis on issues that are policy relevant to Capitol Hill staff. And one of those issues that's the focus of this afternoon's session is infrastructure needs in Southeast Asia. I want to tell a brief story before we turn to our two distinguished presenters, and then we'll have Q&A after their presentations of about 10 minutes each. One of my earliest trips to the region was to Myanmar in 1994. And I was there to see Aung San Suu Kyi in one of the brief periods when she was out of house arrest in the early 90s during military rule. And during my mission, I visited with the Japanese ambassador. And at the time, there was quite a dispute, as there often has been some dispute between the United States and Japan over how to manage relations with Southeast Asian countries that were authoritarian, with the US often taking a rather doctrinaire, hands-off approach, and the Japanese often trying to wield economic influence on behalf of prospects of change and good governance and democratic reform. So I went to see the Japanese ambassador, and I was prepared to read him the Riot Act on behalf of Senator Biden, who had sent me out to the region because Japan at the time was resisting US-led efforts to impose stiffer sanctions on Burma. And the ambassador was very diplomatic, and he greeted me in his office, and he said, "So, how was your trip in from Bangkok?" I said, "It was fine." He said, "So you landed safely at the airport here in Rangoon?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "You're welcome." And I sort of choked on that for a moment. And then I realized, of course, that Japan had repaved the runway and upgraded the avionics and radar systems at the airport to try to ensure safe air travel into and out of Myanmar. And that were it not for that investment, my trip to Myanmar might not have been possible. And the ambassador, in his very diplomatic way, was underscoring a point. I always keep that lesson in mind as I think about issues of policy coordination among the US and its partners, especially Japan, working together in Southeast Asia. And of course, today we have the context of the US-China competition, which seems to overshadow everything to do with questions of infrastructure in Southeast Asia. The Congress has been very active in this space. I will take note of the significant accomplishments of the Congress in passing the BUILD Act during the Trump administration, reforming OPIC, trying to strengthen US infrastructure financing for projects in Southeast Asia. the Blue Dot Network, trying to enhance quality investments in Southeast Asia and set a high bar to compete with China more effectively. And there has been efforts to coordinate more with Japan, with JICA and JBIC, to try to approach joint financing or joint project development in Southeast Asia. To help us talk through the infrastructure needs of Southeast Asia, as well as the overall context of the great power efforts in Southeast Asia to facilitate infrastructure, we have two wonderful presenters today. Satu Lemay is the Vice President of the East-West Center and head of the DC outpost of the East-West Center, where he's been ensconced for a number of years. Satu is a true expert on things Southeast Asian. He is the founding editor of the Asia Pacific Bulletin, which is an essential reading for those of us who are trying to keep track of events in the region. He's also a senior advisor on the China and Indo-Pacific Division at the Center for Naval Analysis, CNA Corp. And he has a tradition of teaching as well at the Paul Nitze School of Johns Hopkins SAIS. Magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Georgetown, so he's got some local DC educational credentials, but of course then also Oxford University doctorate, where he was a George Marshall Scholar, and we're very honored to be joined by Satu. Also joining us this afternoon, a sometimes partner with the East-West Center, former visiting fellow there, Courtney Weatherby, who's a research analyst with the Stimson Center's Southeast Asian Energy, Water, and Sustainability Programs. Courtney's research focuses on sustainable infrastructure and energy development challenges across the Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific. So she's going to be presenting us a slightly more granular look at some of the energy challenges of the region and how the region is trying to meet it, but especially also the role of the US and Japan and other countries, China, in trying to work with Southeast Asian countries to address what is expected to be more than a $2.7 trillion of energy requirements in Southeast Asia just through the year 2040. Southeast Asia does matter. It matters economically. It's a region with a combined GDP the size of the EU. It matters politically and geopolitically because it is ground zero for a lot of the great power rivalries that are playing out between the US, China, and Japan, as well as other powers. And it matters for the hundreds of millions of people who live in the region, whose lives hang in the balance with climate change, many millions of them living only a couple meters above sea level, with lives that will be affected by the typhoons and rising sea level and changes in water patterns associated with glacial melt in the high Himalayas. So the topic of this afternoon is really vital and timely, and we have got two great speakers, and I have now filibustered long enough. So I'm going to turn to Satu Lemay for his opening presentation, and then we'll have Courtney Weatherby's conversation with us, and then we'll take questions. Satu, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Frank, and to the Mansfield Foundation for this invitation. I'm delighted to participate in your program today, and to Kelly Primrose and your team for facilitating that. And of course, always great to join Courtney Weatherby, my colleague at the Stimson Center, with whom we work very closely on a number of projects. And I think already in the chat session, Kelly will put some links to some joint products, including publications that Courtney has wonderfully done, just some terrific publications and analysis she's presented based on our fellowship for the US, Japan, Southeast Asia Visiting Fellows Program. So a couple of personal comments. East-West Center is sort of in the provenance of Mansfield Foundation in the sense it's authorized by the United States Congress. It's partly appropriated through the United States Congress appropriations process. So we are completely nonpartisan and do our work as assigned by Congress, which the authorization language is to promote better understanding and relations between the US and Asia through cooperative study, education, and exchange. And that's what we do through a number of specific programs. The second personal comment I'd like to make is that I didn't know this till 5 minutes ago that Frank was in Myanmar in 94, I should mention, because of the Japan connection and the US-Japan connection, that I had never set foot in Asia in my life. I was not an Asia specialist. I was a Middle East scholar, and worked. My first entry into Asia was via Japan, and my first trip as part of the Japan Ministry of Foreign Affairs Institute for International Affairs, Nihon Kokusai Bondai Genkyusho, was to Myanmar. And that was in 94, where I also met Aung San Suu Kyi. So it's a strange and unknown convergence to me, but happily so. And my final comment apropos this session and my comments, so just so you understand a little bit my vectors, my background was in engineering, working in the engineering slash infrastructure field. My family had my father had an engineering firm. I worked for him on preparing proposals on various things growing up. And I later worked for Ogden Environmental and Energy Services. It was a big company that built energy plants and what have you. I mention that because I think this infrastructure issue is coming back, and coming back in a big way. In part, we forget sometimes because it's put in the great power competition, because Asia is growing. I mean, the good news is, try to believe for a moment, we can get to geopolitical. Hey, this is great news. There's hundreds of millions of people coming out of poverty in a region that's developing. And this public good of roads, rails, ports, infrastructure, airports, water sewage plants, you name it, however you define infrastructure, is being required to improve the lives of dozens and millions of people. So to my vantage point, before we get to the competition and the bad effects and the environmental issues, all of which are real, let's remember this is an opportunity and we should frame it. And by the way, the convergence of timing is incredible, because here we are in the US, yesterday's New York Times, and I quote, the title is, how we're going to manage infrastructure and why it's a national security requirement to be competitive, to be forward-leaning, to be modern, to be technologically advanced, to provide for our people. So if the pandemic has shown anything, good broadband, good digital infrastructure, as well as hard infrastructure is going to be necessary. So there's a real convergence and a real opportunity because of generally good things happen. So before we get to the bad, let's just remember what the underlying impulses of this infrastructure boom are. The second note I'd make is, we are focusing a lot on Chinese BRI, and of course that's true, but if you look at the latest polling in Southeast Asia, this is not the top issue for them. They've got a lot of issues before infrastructure and who funds it. So I would just keep it in perspective. It's not disanalogous from the South China Sea issues. The South China Sea issue is really important in Washington, but on a day-to-day basis, not the most important issue in Southeast Asia. So I'm just trying to draw that when we're considering it in the context of Southeast Asia, we should probably think about placing it in its proper context. Second point I want to make is about China. We can go through all the details and talk about how important China is to this BRI. And I have some data, happy to share it with you about what it's done. But I would note that despite all of this, three things should be kept in mind. First, China's attractiveness to Southeast Asia has declined over the last year, in part because of other issues not having to do with this provision of infrastructure. In fact, general public opinion, according to the 2021 Southeast Asian survey by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, shows a decline in support for China across various measures. The second is that the narrative of the debt trap is far more complicated than we've been given to believe. Are there concerns about debt? Are small countries engaged in maybe too much debt or too? Yes, but as the New Atlantic Council article suggests, as well as other studies suggest, whether it's in Laos or Myanmar or elsewhere, the debt issue related to Chinese provision of infrastructure is much more complicated than everyone is racked with debt and they can't get out of it, and then China's going to take over. And unless PLA forces sit on roads, highways, airports, and deny them use for everyone else, I would just remind you to remember that infrastructure is a public good unless it's monopolized. And if it's monopolized, it's no longer a good. So just remember that you can't use a road if tanks sit on it, no one can use it. It's not sustainable. And the final thing is, let's remember agency of Southeast Asian states. These are not powerless, drifting countries. These countries that for millennia, at least hundreds of years, and certainly in the last 70 of the post-colonial era, navigated quite well between, and sometimes with very negative consequences, but they do manage to have agency. You can see this in the Myanmar decision on the Mitsoni Dam. You can see this in Laos on land acquisitions. You can see this in the Philippines. You can see this in Indonesia. In other words, you can go to several case studies and look at how China also can't just go in and dictate what's going to happen on a particular project. They also have to negotiate with these countries just as the United States does. The third big point I want to make is about US constraints. There are constraints, and they're real ones. We're a private sector-led economy. We can't just go around using taxpayer funds to decide what infrastructure. And in the current climate of fiscal deficits, pandemic recovery, domestic priorities, just as the New York Times article on US infrastructure legislation under the Biden administration suggests, we're not going to have a lot of money to throw around at this. At the end of the day, it's going to be private sector led, and global World Bank studies suggest that only about 15% of global infrastructure is financed by the private sector. That's why governments and multinational banks and others come in. We can go through the constraints. I'm conscious of time, but I just want to flag that there are constraints to the way that the US system is set up, that we're going to compete with China head on head, project by project. It ain't going to happen. And it certainly shouldn't happen. So, which brings me to the real crux of the issues. What are the opportunities for the United States? I think there are lots. I think one important opportunity for the US is to continue to work with our Southeast Asian friends on creating environments, regulatory, best practices, principles, legal, that will make for profitable, bankable projects. Here's another case where they have agency. If Southeast Asia feels like they don't want to rely too much on government spending or SOEs or what have you, or foreign workers, well, they have agency to change their regulatory and legal and profitability matrix to create opportunities for infrastructure investment. If a choice has been building a bridge in Washington State, in my home state, or building one in Malaysia, engineering companies and design companies and construction companies will look at, hey, relative costs of doing that business, transaction costs. And so if Southeast Asia becomes really bankable, really profitable, there are lots of opportunities. There are, of course, all of the mechanisms that Frank mentioned, the Blue Dot Network, the I-10, the BUILD Initiative, and of course, all the MOUs with Japan, Australia, India, the Singapore Infrastructure Fund, and others to work with our allies and partners as well. So the message as I come to the close of my 10 minutes is that there are some significant structural systemic constraints to the US competing head on head with China. But I really would urge, at least on infrastructure, if not in other areas, that we think about this not as a one-to-one competition or a tit for tat, but rather the global goal is to take advantage or to dock ourselves onto a growing economic vibrancy, vitality, youth projection in Southeast Asia, and think about the next 20, 30 years to create the infrastructure and meet the infrastructure requirements that will not only grow Southeast Asia, but therefore for the US, the globe, for our allies and partners, Southeast Asia is resilient and able to be integrated into this global system. And that's, I think, where we ought to think about opportunity rather than the trade-offs. And where bad behavior is active, I think we can work with our partners and allies in Southeast Asia because they're not oblivious to these issues. They don't need to be told about foreign labor coming into work infrastructure projects. They don't need to be told about civil society unrest when infrastructure confiscates land. They don't need to be told about corruption between government elites and infrastructure projects of country X. They don't need to be told about displacement of villages or environmental hazards. So I think that there's lots of work we can do together. And I think particularly US and Japan, given the high standards. If we focus only on US and China, we forget, for example, the Japanese implementation rates for infrastructure are probably 3 to 5 times higher, take your pick, estimates, on the implementation rates of Japan in the region versus China in the region. So let me close with that, and thank you again for the opportunity to make some initial remarks.
Thank you so much, Satu. You very persuasively argue that Southeast Asian countries have agency, and we shouldn't think of them only as sort of the object of great power competition, but the subject of great power opportunity, investment, and partnership. And I think that's a very welcome reminder. You also spoke to some of the constraints on the US role, including the private sector-led style of investment, which we hold has great advantage, but which also has complications in terms of the ability of the United States government to direct or to use infrastructure as a tool of statecraft. And then for later in our discussion, I want to put a pin on an issue that you touched on, but which we may come back to, which is differences between the US and Japan when it comes to things such as constraints on partnering with state-owned enterprises for projects. The Japanese companies and the Japanese government afford their companies greater latitude to partner with SOEs than do American investment arms like OPIC and JBIC, excuse me, and Exim. So there may be some things that we can learn from Japan, or there may be some differences there that reveal different styles that we may want to come back to. Let me turn now to Courtney, who's going to sort of dive a little deeper into what exactly we're talking about when we're discussing infrastructure, roads, bridges, energy, and the like, and what those needs are and how they're being addressed. Courtney, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Frank. I'm happy to join today to talk about this. And since I'm going to be talking about some numbers associated with the infrastructure gap, I'm going to actually share some visuals because I think that's always helpful when we're talking about infrastructure challenges. So I'm going to go ahead and share the PowerPoint, which I believe is coming through, although it looks like it might be sharing the wrong screen with my notes. So let me try that again. And I believe it might still be sharing the wrong screen. Sorry, I have a 2 monitor setup here. So is this sharing the full screen to you guys, Frank, or is it sharing my notes?
To us, I don't see your private notes. I see a PowerPoint display.
Perfect. This doesn't usually happen, so I'll go ahead and get on with it. So I would really just like to sort of highlight the needs. So I know Satu highlighted in his initial comments, and Frank pointed to this too, the real needs on the ground in Southeast Asia. When we're talking about infrastructure development, we're not just talking about outside investors coming in, rolling over local interests to provide big projects and make money. We're talking about projects that meet real needs on the ground for electricity access, to support urbanization, to support industrialization, to support healthcare. And those gaps are quite significant in developing Asia broadly. And Southeast Asia alone faces, just in the energy sector, which underpins so much of the other key aspects of economic development, a gap of $2.7 to $2.9 trillion through 2040. So there's a significant amount of investment that really needs to come in here. And as Satu pointed out earlier, we often see sort of 15% of this coming from the private sector, and a lot of this coming from the public spending, from international development partners. And I think it's really worth looking at some of the numbers here to see how that adds up. So when you look across ASEAN, individual countries spend different percentages of their GDP to meet infrastructure needs, but broadly speaking, most countries spend about 2.1% on average of their total GDP on all infrastructure. So that includes not just energy, but also transportation, healthcare, and other key telecommunications infrastructure, water infrastructure. So when you think about that, that averages out to about $50 billion on an annual basis across all of ASEAN. When you compare that against the amount of spending that's needed just to meet the energy infrastructure needs through 2040, you're left with approximately a $70 billion gap. Now, some of that undoubtedly is filled by international development partners when we're looking at multinational development banks like the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, AIIB, there's the US Development Finance Corporation, there's JICA, there's JBEC, there's OPEC, and there's a range of other development banks from the EU and from Australia. But even if you add all of that up, that comes to approximately $50 billion a year in terms of what they usually spend on energy infrastructure. Now, even if we assume a relatively unrealistic figure that half of that, or almost $22 billion goes just to Southeast Asia instead of the globe, because almost all of these banks have a global mandate for where they have to balance interests in investment. We can see that that still leaves a significant infrastructure gap, much broader than the 15% that Satya had highlighted we often see from the private sector. So really, when we're looking at international support for infrastructure in Southeast Asia, we don't just need to see direct investment from international development partners in infrastructure and in financing, but we really need to see support and capacity building to prioritize changes in regulatory regimes and policies that will make these projects bankable, so that some of that remaining infrastructure gap is filled by the private sector, and that can reach much higher than 15%. And when we're looking at individual constraints, again, I think it's relevant to sort of point out that no individual country is really willing or able to come in and provide that $2.9 trillion of investment for Southeast Asia on their own. This of necessity has to be a collaborative approach between private sector and development partners and local governments, as well as between different countries. So within that overall, I think it's worth exploring exactly what type of engagement China is doing in infrastructure investment in Southeast Asia. And again, I'm going to use the energy sector as sort of a specific case study here because we have the most data, I think, around what China is doing. And when you look broadly at China's Belt and Road Initiative, funds starting from 2013 to the end of 2020 have largely been targeted towards only two sectors: energy, which pulled about 39% of the global support under BRI, and transportation, which pulled about 25%. The remainder mostly went into real estate, extractive industries, tourism, and other sort of local industries, which benefit from energy and transportation infrastructure. And when you look within the energy sector globally, we can see very clearly, if you look at sort of the upper right chart here, that China's investment is almost entirely targeted towards fossil fuels, with the largest amount going towards oil and then coal, large-scale hydropower development, and then gas and LNG. And when you look at sort of alternative infrastructure, whether that's transmission needs or efficiency, which fall under the unspecified category, solar, wind, biomass, these alternative technologies are a very small portion of the support that China brings to the board globally. And this also holds true in Southeast Asia. So our team at the Stimson Center manages a data set that's pretty comprehensive, specifically for the 5 mainland countries of Southeast Asia, the Mekong countries of Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Myanmar, and Vietnam. And when you look at China's investments in that region, we can see, if you look at the projects that China is specifically investing in, most of the projects, almost 60% of China's investment and engagement in energy in mainland Southeast Asia is just in large-scale hydropower. The remainder is then largely coal, a surprisingly high amount of solar investment, and then other energy technologies after that. But when you look at the installed capacity, so when you're thinking not just of numbers of project, but sizes of project, you can see that 92% of China's involvement is in coal and hydropower. So half of it alone is in coal projects. So China is hugely investing in coal. So when you're looking at the types of investment that China is doing, they are in some ways naturally, they are riskier projects. There are a lot more concerns. There's a lot more public pushback surrounding coal and surrounding large-scale hydropower at this point than there is surrounding solar projects, and that has a lot to do with the carbon considerations, the environmental considerations from coal and hydropower projects, the land impacts on local communities, as well as the point that Satya and Frank had raised about sort of workforce, where China is known for many of these large scale projects to bring in skilled workers from China rather than hire local communities. So, that is in some ways, some of those risks and critiques raised against China's involvement in the region can be traced to the type of projects that China is investing in compared to the type of projects that other stakeholders are investing in. And I do think that there's a lot of space for evolution here. And it's worth recognizing that if you look at China's investment in the previous year, globally, 2020 was a departure. The economic slowdown, China's own limitations, resulted in a drop by more than half of the usual amounts that China was spending on Belt and Road Initiative, and the type of energy projects within China's investment skewed much more towards renewable energy as a proportion of the total than they ever have in previous years. So I think that there's no clear sign if that's a one-off or a trend. That's something that's worth watching given the greenwashing language that's coming out surrounding BRI projects. But if China were to transition its energy investments towards more sustainable projects and follow through on some of the language that has been said on meeting, for instance, the G20 high quality infrastructure targets, then China could play an extremely positive role in meeting the gap and meeting the regional needs. And within that space, I also really want to flag that here in the United States, we often talk about China as a monolith, where any investment that is Chinese is a Belt and Road Initiative. Any investment that is Chinese is often sort of talked about as a part of China's overall strategy. Whereas in reality, there is often a notable difference in behavior between the large state-owned enterprises and the smaller scale private sector companies that are coming abroad. So if you look at that yellow solar percentage here in these pie charts, almost all of that solar investment is coming from private sector companies in China. It's not coming from state-owned enterprises. So there really is a much broader space in which China is acting when it's addressing energy investments or infrastructure investments more broadly than you might get at initial picture. So I don't want to keep talking through some of these details. I think a lot of this is something we can discuss with all of you and sort of address what you're interested in. But I really just want to sort of hit again that China is one of many actors in the region. There's a huge amount of investment coming from Japan. This chart here is showing sort of the percentage of all projects under development, and then the percentages for coal and renewable energy projects coming from key outside investors. And I think it's really useful to point out that China might have a broader role in the overall energy investments in the region, but Thailand is actually second. If you exclude Thailand's investments inside Thailand and only look at Thailand's investments in its neighboring countries, Thailand has almost as much investment as China does. Japan has a large amount of investment. The multinational development banks, EU countries, South Korea, and even the United States all play a role here. And this data set is certainly not complete. There's a lot of projects where there is no financial data or sponsorship data in terms of the countries involved. So, there are some gaps here, and there are also a lot of countries that are just not on this list. But within that space, I think there's a lot of opportunity to bring China into some of the other discussions that other actors on this chart are having. So Satya and Frank already mentioned Japan. We've talked extensively in public forums before about sort of opportunities for the United States to collaborate with Japan. There's a wide range of MOUs that have been signed. I think that there's real opportunity here to engage with Chinese stakeholders, whether government or private sector, about the standards that they're using, to look to the principles that were endorsed by the G20 for quality infrastructure, the language of which really came from Japan and was agreed to with the United States, Australia, and many other key players here, to really push that language, to really push agreement on those standards, and to look within even some of the initiatives like the Blue Dot Network, which were often framed as sort of an opportunity to compete with China, and explore whether there's space for China to become a part of that initiative. If there's a project that meets those standards, for instance, that is Chinese funded or Chinese built, is there any reason that can't be included as an example, flagship example, alongside flagship examples from the United States and Japan of high quality infrastructure projects that are forward-looking and sustainable? So I do think that despite the geopolitical framing, there are real opportunities to look at the needs and look at what's happening on the ground and identify areas for collaboration on messaging, capacity building, and technical assistance. So I'm going to go ahead and just stop there. I don't want to take up too much time in this conversation because I think there's going to be a lot of great questions from those in the audience. So I'm going to turn things back to Frank now.
Thank you so much, Courtney. You've packed a lot into those slides, and it was really informative for me to see the blend of investment in terms of energy versus other sectors of infrastructure, it shouldn't be surprising that energy is such a dominant portion of the overall investment, I suppose, given what Satu laid out at the beginning, that these are growing regions and with growing energy needs. Sometimes I forget that the fact that the United States is achieving economic growth while reducing our total energy consumption is a function of the state of our economic development and the kinds of offshoring of heavy industrial production and a lot of stuff that is energy intensive that no longer takes place within the 50 states. But for the Southeast Asian nations, energy demand is projected to continue to grow rapidly as they develop at this stage of their development. I want to tease out a couple of questions that you brought up, Courtney. One is this notion of translating the US, Japan, China rivalry into a potential area of cooperation and cooperative development in those areas, especially where the Chinese private sector may be in the lead, like on solar, and where, as you put it, high quality, sustainable, and forward-looking Chinese investments might be found that are compatible with the US and Japanese and European efforts to set the bar for high quality infrastructure investments. Could you go a little more deeply into how you envision that happening? Would it be necessary, for instance, for the US or Japan to join the AIIB as Korea and many European states have done, for us to participate meaningfully in some of those Chinese initiatives or Chinese-led initiatives? Are you suggesting a discussion with China on the Blue Dot Network that would essentially say to the Chinese, you know, we hope that you'll look at this Blue Dot standard and try to meet it, and if you do, you know, we stand ready to work with you? How would we operationalize this concept of trying to identify high quality Chinese investments that would be potentially available as cooperative joint ventures?
Yes, I'll take a quick crack, and then I think Satu might have some thoughts on this as well. But I don't think it's necessary for the United States to join the AIIB, and I think politically that might be difficult as a sell here in the United States. I do think, though, when you look at the Blue Dot Network, it's been a little delayed in its rollout because of the pandemic and everything else happening this past year. But the ultimate goal for the Blue Dot Network is to essentially be able to verify that projects are high quality and sort of highlight them as flagship successes in this space. So I think ultimately my understanding is that one of the goals for the Blue Dot Network is not just to have sort of a list of flagship projects, but to have a list of very specific standards on a range of key areas, whether that's social environmental impact assessments, whether that's local safety, local labor and workforce integration, carbon emissions. I don't think that they've made that clear yet, but whatever those standards are, they're supposed to be applied across the board, and projects can essentially get verified as meeting them. I think one of the key opportunities here is to just make it very clear any country's project that is proven to meet those standards can make it onto the list. I think a lot of the initial language sort of viewed this through an anti-China lens, but there's no reason it has to be that way. And it still would hold those Chinese projects that apply for that verification or that labeling to the same standard as all of the other projects that are in, but would avoid sort of putting up a wall and saying that China's just excluded.
Thanks, Courtney. And Satu, did you want to add any additional comments on this idea of how to sort of open the Blue Dot Network to the Chinese in terms of trying to have them meet those standards?
Sorry, I didn't have my audio on. I think Courtney's dead on. I would add one other element, which is not so much about bringing in China or standards, but indirectly addresses this. One project we're working on is how civil society interacts with infrastructure projects in a systematic way. So, as I said, having worked in this business before, all countries have, at least on paper, to a lesser or greater extent, mechanisms and processes that are supposed to be followed for approving infrastructure projects and all elements thereof. That can range from in what we call in the United States, environmental impact statements to, for example, as you all know, producing new baseload capacity in the energy sector in the United States requires passage through the Public Utility Commission because you got to approve the rates, right? You can't just decide I'm going to build this gas power plant. There's oversight, the public utility, there's community hearings. Now, to a lesser or a greater extent, as we've been investigating across Southeast Asia, there are these things on the books, but as might be expected in the real world, there is a greater or lesser adherence to those mechanisms and regulations. So one thing we can do, because it will bring everybody on board, and instead of being aimed at you, China, join these standards, you, Japan, and the US will dictate the standards through the G7, G20 process, could be, hey, Southeast Asia country X, here's what you technically require in your constitution and your regulations for approving infrastructure. So when whoever is building it, I don't particularly care who's building this public good, you got to adhere to these standards, you got to follow these processes. That has two payoffs. One, it gives everyone adherence to good standards and makes them play by the same rules. And second, it's very sustainable domestically when you're acquiring land, displacing people off property, doing large industrial agriculture, whether that be Montagnard rubber plantations or building a hydropower. So I think that's what I would add to this discussion about standards and making it applicable to all.
I thank you for that, Satu. I think it also plays to an American strength in terms of human capital development in Southeast Asia, which is pennies on the dollar what it costs to build the actual power plant. But if you're empowering civil society and working with communities to fulfill their statutory oversight role and participatory role in project development, then that would be potentially an area of US a comparative advantage through the National Endowment for Democracy or other mechanisms with USAID to sort of strengthen the voices of civil society across Southeast Asia so that those laws on the books are actually implemented as opposed to ignored. Great observation. There's a question from the floor from Ian Clements, specifically for you, Courtney. Do we have good data on how much US private sector capital is invested in projects in Southeast Asia as a share of the total investment? And I think that this question implicitly gets to a misapprehension that somehow China is the dominant player across Southeast Asia, because there is a difference between cumulative investment versus annual new investment. And while the Chinese have been pouring a lot of new projects in, you mentioned already, Courtney, that the implementation rate is higher on Japanese investments, for instance, than on Chinese. The Chinese talk a good talk, but not of all of these projects materialize. But also there's the question of Johnny come lately. And a lot of European and Japanese and American companies have been in the region a lot longer than the Chinese have been. But anyway, do we have data on that?
So I don't think we have as clear data on that as I would like to see. And I think one reason for that gets back to something that I think you actually mentioned in your opening remarks, Frank, and that Satu elaborated on, which is that the US private sector behaves very independently from the US government. We don't have the ability to direct investment. So a lot of Chinese companies are very upfront. They're receiving support through BRI. They're receiving financing support from policy banks in China. They're very clearly Chinese. I think a lot of American companies don't necessarily put that American identity out front. So I do think when you're looking at America's investment in the region, it can be a little bit harder to parse that out sometimes. And another aspect to this is sort of where the United States is investing. So when we're looking at hard infrastructure projects, when you talk about which companies are involved, almost all of the statistics and even the data that our team has been able to collect for the Mekong Infrastructure Tracker looks at the sponsor developer company, the financier lender or the construction company. It doesn't look at the supply chain. America is heavily involved in the supply chain for a number of projects throughout the region, but that is not going to necessarily be reflected. And similarly, a lot of the American investment in companies that have been active for decades are in manufacturing. They're not necessarily going out and building the bridge directly. So I do think that makes it hard to frame both sort of in the framing of US-China competition, because we're not apples and oranges in terms of comparison for what we're doing, but it makes it hard to sort of pull that data together.
Yeah, thanks for that, Courtney. Satu?
Yeah, just on that, I mean, this is a case where we've worked the data for a lot, and this is from our ASEAN Matters for America, America Matters for ASEAN project. If you look on page 2021, the link is in your chat. Here's the way I look at it. Our stock of investment in the region, which as in Southeast Asia, surpasses our investment, is more than the US has directed to China, India, Japan, and South Korea combined. Now just think about that. Let me repeat, more than what the US has invested in China, India, Japan, and South Korea combined. There are a couple of caveats depending on how you decide to count Hong Kong and Taiwan. Okay. But let's call it, we used the number 329 billion in our last one. We're updating it this year. We'll be releasing it with the US ASEAN Business Council later on this year. Let's use a 300 billion. I'm not good at math. If you look at that and you take out consumer and services and banking and that kind of stuff, I'm willing to posit without chemistry level molar weight measurements that it's roughly about 55 to 60% is infrastructure, depending on how you define infrastructure. And I think that's very important. This is quite different from roads, rails, bridges, and ports, of which we probably have less. But if you're counting digital infrastructure, if you're counting health infrastructure, if you're counting educational services and the infrastructure related to that, a whole host of things that might be on the softer side, I'm willing to posit of the 300 billion stock, you might be able to come up with roughly 50% in the infrastructure space, which call it now, we're now talking 150 billion. But it's clear that the pace of US investment in traditional infrastructure, roads, rails, bridges, forget high speed, we're not there. We're lagging, and China is making up, and Japan is making up. And again, there are lots of figures for this, and I'd be happy to address and find those figures. But the last time I looked at implementation rates, Chinese implementation rates on infrastructure, notwithstanding pledged funding, was give or take between 15 and 21%. And in the last 2 years, even lower because of the pandemic, obviously. Japanese may take some time to go in, but their implementation rates are roughly around 75%. So when it's pledged, it happens, which will not surprise anyone on this call about Japanese ways of doing business. It may take some time to get there, but once that decision is made, this isn't just a kind of, we'll report it to the board of trustees that we're going to do this. They'll do it. And I'm also giving you a link here to the Asia Foundation Task Force on US Southeast Asia Relations. Frank and I both served on that task force. And one chapter is on infrastructure, and it gives you some figures drawn from international sources that you can refer to as well.
Thank you, Satu. And thanks for plugging that Asia Foundation Task Force. It was fun collaborating with you on it. Tetsuro Hisano from Mitsubishi Heavy asks, what do we see next in terms of rule setting, especially on things relating to, I think he's referring to energy. There seems to be a gap between what the EU is doing in terms of prioritizing clean energy projects and renewables, and what the Japanese and the Americans, certainly under Trump, and then there's a little bit of a question mark in my mind about the Americans under Biden, were doing in terms of, for instance, Japan, certainly very active in the coal-fired power plant construction across Southeast Asia. and the US under Trump pushing hard on coal and LNG exports, I guess, to meet some of the energy demands of Southeast Asia. But what do we expect in terms of how that gap between an EU clean energy renewable focus versus a US and a Japan approach, and then we know where the Chinese are. I mean, Courtney's laid out that heavy into fossil fuels, oil, gas, and LNG investments. How does this play out a little bit? Courtney, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. And, I think that it's worth recognizing that it's going to play out a little differently in each of the ASEAN countries because they have wild differences in where they're going. So I think one example that's very forward looking and may show the direction that a lot of countries are moving is if you look at Vietnam, they rolled out 9 gigawatts of solar power last year, which for anyone who's not familiar, sort of that amount, that brought solar power to about 25% of Vietnam's total installed power capacity as of the end of 2020. That was extremely unexpected. It was done largely because of the policies that were beneficial for the private sector to invest in large-scale rooftop solar and to invest in commercial-scale solar, but it sets Vietnam on an extremely forward-looking pathway. And none of the other countries in ASEAN are necessarily quite following that yet, but we are seeing the signs. When you look at auctions for new power projects in other countries, we're seeing prices from renewable energy that are now competing or even outcompeting traditional energy sources. So I do think that for many countries, that's going to require a rethink of their national planning targets. And that provides an opportunity for countries from the EU and for private companies that are all ahead on renewable alternative energy investments. At the same time, because of the massive energy demand growth, electricity demand growth in particular in Southeast Asia, LNG is going to continue to be a particular focus for many countries in the region. They don't see a path forward that's 100% renewable. And even Vietnam is still embracing targets for LNG. I think they're about to publish their next power development plan. I think that's going to set sort of a good feel for us on where some of the countries are going. But it's not a one or the other. It's going to still be an all of the above approach. The one area where I think there are big questions is regarding coal, just because it is so unpopular domestically in many of these countries. You face protests about the coal pollution concerns. And I do think that is a question. Vietnam, again, as an example, Thailand is another example, have both looked to suspend or perhaps cancel major coal projects in recent years due to those concerns. And I think given climate vulnerability in Southeast Asia, it's South Indo-Pacific broadly, South and Southeast Asia, 10 of the top 20 most vulnerable countries to climate change are in that area of the world. They have regular climate disasters, whether they're floods, droughts, typhoons. So I think there is sort of this growing recognition among the public that is starting to pressure policymakers, and that could have an impact on coal. So I think within that space, the United States needs to sort of, carefully look at where its strengths are and where the opportunities are and continue to move forward. And I think there is probably some space for LNG in that space, as much as I personally would love to see a huge transition towards renewables.
Thanks for that, Courtney. You remind us of something really fundamental about ASEAN and Southeast Asia, which is the incredible diversity that marks the ASEAN 10. Different stages of development, different energy profiles, different indigenous energy supplies, and different levels of energy independence, and different environmental opportunities for geothermal, wind, solar, tidal, and hydro. So thank you for reminding us not to try to apply sort of a uniform standard when we think about the diverse needs of this diverse region. It's a very good point. Let's see. We had a question from Ben Self, Vice President of the Mansfield Foundation. Ben, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question directly of our presenters? Do we have that capability, Kelly? I think we do. Ben may have stepped away. The question, no, there he is.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
I noticed the IFC was missing from Courtney's wonderful presentation about the sources of funding. And I know that they have been an active player in the energy infrastructure domain. And it seems like they're an important node connecting the international development banks, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, to the private sector. And they often actually act as a sort of broker, bringing in some of their own funds as well as other private funds. So I'm thinking if we focus on that as a node, it could be a way to propagate some of the norms or the high quality infrastructure standards outside of the formal international institutions and into the private sector community. And I'd just be curious about your thoughts on that potential.
Yeah, so the IFC is absolutely involved in the region, and leaving them out, I think, was just an unintentional. I think I may have grouped some of the financing amounts linked to the World Bank financing amounts in the charts that I had there. So I'm very aware of them, and I do see real opportunities, particularly within sort of the technical capacity building and planning spaces for the IFC to play a major role in helping shape the norms and targets the countries themselves have, and in sort of identifying opportunities for the countries to do more engagement with the private sector. So I know they've been very involved in basin planning for hydropower in different areas around the region. I know they've done a huge amount of capacity building for sort of meeting modern forward-looking standards in terms of looking at social, environmental, and economic sustainability for individual project assessments. And I think given the links that they have to the private sector, that there's absolutely space there. I don't think they're the only ones in that space. And I think that there's definitely opportunity for other actors, whether that's other multinational development banks or groups like USAID and JICA, to also provide support in sort of building that capacity and institutional ability to frame things in a regulatory and policy sense in a way that makes sense to attract private investment.
Thanks for that answer, Courtney. Satu, anything to add about IFC and the financing role there?
Yes, sorry. No, I simply don't know anything about IFC's particular role other than its financing role, why its standards would matter more than the World Bank or ADB standards. I don't even know if they're different from the larger international multilateral bank structure.
Thanks. I think we have just a few more minutes left. Are there other questions from the floor that I may have missed? There was a question from Hong Fong Fo, who is kindly reminded us that he is using the alias account of Ian Clements today. He's borrowed that that account for the login. But he asks about China and the so many coal and hydro plants. You know, are these investments meeting an actual immediate demand for electricity in the region, or are they perhaps, I think the implication is, are they perhaps more speculative? I know that on visitation to Laos in the late 90s, I observed a Chinese micro hydro investment, which was actually meeting an energy demand in China. There was going to be a portion of that investment that yielded electric power for a Laotian community, but some of the power was intended for retransmission across borders, exploiting the preferred hydro environment that made itself available in Laos. And funny story, when I visited, of course, I was assured by the Laotian officials that all the laborers down there working the project were Laotian. And I cried out to them in Mandarin Chinese, "Hey, 你们从哪儿来的?" And where are you all from? And of course, they were from Henan and Yunnan and other places. But is this meeting an immediate need, or how much of this electric power investment in the region is kind of speculative, or perhaps meeting a Chinese need?
I'll just jump in and say, I think in many cases, it is meeting an immediate need. The big exception being Laos, and to some degree also some of the proposed projects in Myanmar, many of which were intended for construction and then sale of electricity back to China. I do also think even in cases where the electricity demand justifies investments, one of the big issues that we're seeing in the region right now is a difference in terms of investment for power generation and the transmission lines and grid development that is necessary to bring that power where it needs to go. So you absolutely have some places like Cambodia where the annual electricity demand growth is usually 20%. You need to add 20% more electricity than you had last year every year for a decade. And so any energy investment for power generation there is likely meeting an immediate need because of that. But there's not necessarily the transmission lines in place to make sure that all of that electricity is constantly used or that it's getting to where it needs. And this is particularly a challenge when you're looking at integrating renewable energy into the region, because you need to have the market available when the electricity is produced and be able to draw from other areas when the sun is not shining or the wind is not blowing. So I do think that there's a big challenge there. And Laos in particular has kind of over-invested with the assumption that there will be a market and that there will be transmission to get the electricity to that market. And that has not been borne out by reality.
Thanks for that. Yes, Satu.
Just on that, of course, Courtney is very close to these issues and an extraordinarily careful and talented watcher of these issues. I want to give you a sort of perspective on it rather than the knowledge on it. Having worked in the nuclear energy business, we were told in the 70s and 60s that it was going to be too cheap to meter, right? And we were told that oil could be managed price and baseload capacities would be X and Y and Z. And we did all the calculations that we need this much baseload. But as Frank pointed out very early on, our efficiency and productivity rates and the energy use per unit of measurement of productivity have gone down. And with new technology and new developments, I'm a little cautious about predicting what we'll need at the local level and transmission level. Some of these decisions are not 20 years out. They're about who's getting money now, who's financing it now, who's getting the contracts to build it now, or in the next 5 years or 3 years or 2 years or whatever it is. But I'm just cautious about this stuff. I don't think all of this stuff is built on some physics-like calculus. Some of this is political, it's business, it's under the table. It's all of those things that are human and decision-making matrix. And having, as I said, worked in the nuclear energy business, I'm very cautious about determining what we'll need. The new McKinsey study on workforce, when we talk about demographic trends, has a big worry about the loss of labor in Southeast Asia because it's a youthful population which is going to need jobs. On the other hand, that's something to think about and worry about. On the other hand, if you think about Japan, its demographic decline, Japan may be best off because it won't need the labor just when it's losing labor, because of the trend lines in labor need rates relative to production. So quite apart from what's happening today or tomorrow or the next 3 years, if we look out, I think the picture is going to be much more complicated about these. And what's going to drive it really, I think, is the tolerance level for a new generation of young people in Southeast Asia about what kinds of environmental standards and what kinds of climate change effects and what kind of technological and modernity fixes they're going to want. And I think in that context, big hydro, big coal is going to face constraints because of normative issues rather than purely financial or technical issues. And I would just offer that to maybe give you a perspective that's not based just on numbers.
Seems like a fair point. I see Courtney nodding affirmation rather than challenging that assumption.
Absolutely agree with everything Satu just said, yes.
Well, this does bring us to the end of our hour. As is often the case with our Mansfield Capitol Hill policy dialogues, when you have this engaging a discussion, it goes by very quickly. But I want to thank Satu Lemay and Courtney Weatherby for really stimulating, informed, well-informed, authoritative exploration of the infrastructure challenges in Southeast Asia, how those are being addressed by the United States and other players, Japan, China. And I think we may have to invite you back. This has been really stimulating, and there are a lot of issues we didn't have time to get to, including even, Satu, the future of nuclear power in the region, which to me, I think is a very interesting question and subject to a lot of technological as well as community norm issues that may shape that. But I want to, on behalf of everyone at the Mansfield Foundation, I want to thank Kelly Primrose for organizing. I want to thank again our corporate friends of Mansfield for making this dialogue series possible. I want to especially thank all of you from Capitol Hill who joined, and to promise to you that once COVID permits, we will be back on Capitol Hill, providing you with a nourishing lunch to nourish your bodies, and nourishing, stimulating speakers to nourish your brains as soon as we are able to get back. And unless either Satu or Courtney have any final thoughts that you need to share, then I will declare this session of the Capitol Hill Policy Dialogue of Mansfield adjourned until next time. Thank you so much for joining us. This program has been recorded and will be available for your future reference on our website. Thank you all.
Thank you, Frank.
Thanks, Frank.